are 290, 308, 338. 290, 308, or 338?
290.
I'd say 338.
238.
It's 338, guys. Canada's vast geography and scattered population is divided into 338 electoral districts or ridings in the House of Commons. One representative or member of parliament is elected for each riding. The number of ridings in a province is based on its population.
Justin Trudeau casts his ballot in Montreal. Jagmeet Singh gets out the vote in Burnaby, British Columbia. Yves-François Blanchet casts his vote in Shawinigan, Quebec. And Elizabeth May votes in Sydney, British Columbia. It's time to have your say. Welcome to the program. I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Thank you for joining us on CPAC. It is Election Day, and by the way, we are expecting Andrew Shearer to do some get out the vote event in just minutes from now in Saskatchewan. So we'll be going to that live as soon as it begins. All of the federal party leaders have been back in their home ridings today, casting ballots, rallying supporters. Tonight they'll be eagerly awaiting the results to see if 40 days of campaigning was enough to bring their party to victory. Did the promises they made resonate with voters? Were their policies clear? Our question to you on this election day: what is the deciding factor in how you are voting? Call us at 1-877-296-2722 or tweet us at CPAC_TV. You can also email us at haveyoursay@cpac.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Joining us for our discussion on Election Day are Paul Adams from Carleton University, Francis Abel, also from Carleton University, Theo Argydas from Bloomberg News, and Maura Forrest of the National Post. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great to be here.
Maura, what do you think on Election Day? What are you going to be watching for when the results start coming in tonight?
Well, I suspect it might be a late night compared to 2015 when, we sort of saw the election called pretty early in the night once it was clear that all of Eastern Canada, or all of the Atlantic provinces at least, had gone Liberal. I think we're unlikely to see that this time. I think one of the things I'm going to be looking for is really sort of some kind of regional divisions. I think we're seeing the Bloc Québécois obviously surging in Quebec. I think we're expecting the Bloc to take a large number of seats in Quebec, likely. The NDP, by contrast, probably going to be nearly shut out of Quebec, but will likely have some stronger representation in BC and Ontario. I think we're probably going to see consolidation of Conservative support out west in the Prairie provinces, and then the Liberals, sort of in Ontario and Quebec and Eastern Canada. So I'm going to be looking for some of those kind of real regional divisions. But I think at this point, it's really tough to say exactly what's going to happen tonight. I think we're in for a long night.
Mm-hmm. Francis, what do you think this election has been about, and what do you think has been driving it for Canadians? What have been on the minds of voters in this campaign?
I've been thinking about more what hasn't been part of the election campaign. Indigenous issues, which were so important in the 2015 election, have hardly surfaced even in the leaders' debate. They managed to work their way away from Indigenous issues to pipelines very quickly. And foreign policy, there's been no substantive discussion of foreign policy or Canada-US relations in a time when those things are very important for our country. So it's a strange election in that sense, in which we haven't been talking about the most important things.
Interesting. Theo, what about from a fiscal perspective? Of course, we do have costed platforms for all of the parties. Some of them arrived sooner than others, and there was a lot of back and forth about that over the course of the campaign. But what's the choice that Canadians have today with regard to the financial issues?
Well, fiscal policy is one of the wedge issues in a campaign that didn't have many wedge issues, and that's, I think something that the Liberals have tried to play on more, because they're the ones who are actually using the deficits as a lever to attack the Conservatives. So yes, we're running deficits. You want to balance the budget. How are you going to manage that? How are you going to cut? So I think it's definitely one of the issues that you can actually distinguish the two parties on. Now, whether that really matters over the next 2 years, probably not. Both parties actually in 2020 are projecting deficits of above $20 billion. The Conservatives have a deficit of $23 billion. The Liberals have a deficit of $27 billion. Beyond 2020, there you get the differences. The Conservatives have a bigger challenge. Not only do they need to finance their own campaign promises, but they actually have to bring down the Liberal deficit. So it's a little bit of a bigger challenge for them. But it has been one of the wedge issues in this campaign.
Yeah. Paul, let's talk about what the opinion polls are telling us going into the final few hours of this campaign. It's been very close all the way along. The Liberals and the Conservatives have both seen their support decline over the course of the campaign. The Bloc Québécois and the NDP have been rising. What do you make of all of that? There seems to be somewhat of a consensus anyway that the Liberals and the Conservatives are close. Some polls have one party slightly ahead of the other, but they're all, it seems, within the margin of error.
This is a really difficult election to call based on the polls. As you say, it's funny because we've had so much attention on the polls in this campaign, and yet the Liberals and the Conservatives have remained within a point or a point and a half of each other in most polls through most of the campaign, but they have been diminishing, and we now, at this point, we have them both in most polls less than a third of the electorate, and that's a shocking thing when you think that the government that's going to be formed after tonight might quite well be a government that has the support of fewer than a third of voters. But we're also seeing quite a bit of, I'd say, uncertainty and variability in the polls. Ecos, which is a firm where I used to work, has the Liberals very close to a majority. They are disagreeing with the aggregate, with the average poll, which I think is the more reliable indicator. But even before we came on the air, I was talking about if you look at polls that use the telephone in Ontario, you see a gap for the Liberals of 10, 12, 13 points. That suggests a big Liberal win. But if you look at the polls that were done online, the gap is 4 points or 5 points. So I would say that this is quite an uncertain election. We've talked about uncertainty of the polls before, and I think that anybody who, I'm making my prediction like others following the campaign closely, but anyone who bets their house based on the polls is making a big mistake, because anything from in my view, from a small Liberal majority to a generous Conservative minority, any one of those possibilities is a real one, and I wouldn't be shocked by any of those results.
Yeah, and there are variables, obviously, that come into play with polling numbers, who actually shows up and votes, where they are, whether some parties split the vote in some ridings. There are lots of variables, and those variables matter more the closer the two main parties are.
Right, and turnout and the ground games of the parties, the Conservatives have traditionally had an advantage. They've also tended to have more older voters who are more likely to turn out even if an election is a bit sour and not exciting the way this one is. On the other hand, in Quebec, the Bloc Québécois doesn't have much of a ground game so far as we can see, but on the other hand, we've seen in the past Quebec can go in waves. The NDP didn't have a ground game in 2011 when they swept the province, right? So there's a lot of uncertainties about what's going to happen tonight.
And why are we here now, Maura? Why is this where we've ended up at the end of this election campaign? Because it could be historic if neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals get at least 33% of the vote.
That's right. I mean, I think this has been a campaign where no party has managed to really galvanize Canadians. The Conservatives and Liberals, obviously they're front runners in the campaign, but neither party has managed to pull ahead. I think neither party has managed to put out some kind of grand vision that really motivates Canadians in the way that we did see, I think, with the Liberals in 2015. I think that a lot of the focus in this campaign has been fairly negative, and I think a lot of Canadians are probably casting their votes more in a way to prevent the person that they don't want in power, rather than for any sort of real positive vision for the country. And I think that's part of what you're seeing reflected in the fact that neither the Liberals or the Conservatives have managed to get above 33%. And I think that is maybe also contributing to why you've seen this sort of late surge of the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, which I don't think many people were really expecting early in the campaign. I think people are maybe sort of casting about looking for something different, because there really hasn't been a very inspiring message put forward by either of the frontrunners in this campaign.
Frances, do you think this has been a bit of a none of the above election, as some people have described it?
Well, I don't know how we actually would know that
Right.
that's true. That's the why I hesitate. The NDP candidate, it could be a matter of just, I don't like the other two guys, but it also was a spectacularly good campaign, a spectacular campaign. Both those leaders, from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, are very good communicators, are very appealing campaigners, and I think we have to give them credit for some of the increase in their votes.
Yeah.
What it means in their projected votes, what it will mean at the ballot box, will be very interesting to see that.
Yeah, and if that is the result, Theo, what does that mean exactly? Is it a divided country? Will there be regional lines that will be drawn as a result of this?
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how the Liberals do in Ontario, because we might end up having, three regional blocs represented in Parliament. You have the Bloc in Quebec, you have the Liberals dominating in Ontario, and then you have the Conservatives out west. I think, though, nationally, I think what we're seeing here really is what happens when the electorate don't like either of the two main competitors. This is, I don't know if you how long you've been monitoring politics, but I can't remember a time when the two main options had negative net approval ratings, and Canadians are looking at those options and thinking maybe there's, maybe they'll go somewhere else. I mean, that certainly is the case in Quebec. And we're seeing, the Greens up until now doing well in the polls. The NDP has had its comeback. The question is whether these Canadians who are looking at these two leaders and looking at the Greens, looking at the NDP, or looking at the Bloc actually come out and vote. And that, a lot will depend on, whether they vote for these three smaller parties or just decide not to vote today. And that could actually have an outcome on the actual share of the votes that we're seeing that are so low. And right now, we might actually, if these voters don't come out to vote, we actually might see those the share of that vote increase.
There's an irony here that the opponents of electoral reform after the last election, in which Justin Trudeau advocated electoral reform and said we weren't going to run an election on this basis again, the proponents of the existing system say they don't want to have these complex kind of pizza parliaments where you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Some of the seat projections based on the current numbers have 132 and 132 Tories and 132 Liberals, and we could have the situation where the Liberals don't have enough natural allies with the NDP and the Greens to form a stable government, and the Conservatives option presumably would be the Bloc Québécois, and that's not somewhere they want to go. So we may have the kind of ungovernable parliament that the advocates of our existing system said they wanted
right.
to stick. And there really is I think there is going to be another discussion of this after the election, possibly depending on the dynamics, because if the Liberals are close enough to form a government with the support of the NDP and the Greens, then what are they going to be putting on the menu? Maybe one of them is going to be electoral reform. So it's going to be a very, very it's possibly going to be a very interesting parliament after, and maybe a difficult one to govern.
Yeah. Maura, do you think it'll be difficult for someone to govern? I guess a lot of it does depend on that math, right?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say at this point. I think a lot of signs are pointing to a minority government, though, as Paul was mentioning earlier, I think, we can't rule out the possibility of a majority still. But I think in the case of a minority government, I mean, yes, so much does come down to the math. I think, you know, you have to think about situations where is it possible that the Liberals and the NDP together still don't have enough votes, still don't have those 170 votes that they would need for a majority in the House of Commons. What happens then? You know, who do they get support from then? I think the Bloc is a real sort of unknown here. The Bloc has said they certainly won't form any coalitions with anyone. They will vote on a case-by-case basis. But the Bloc is going to have very particular priorities that won't always jive with the rest of the parties and with the rest of the country. Depending on how much power the Bloc has, I think that could be a real challenge in the House of Commons. Certainly if you have the Conservatives getting the most seats tonight, that's a difficult calculation as well. Who are their allies going to be in the House of Commons? Do they turn to the Bloc, and what does that look like? The NDP has said they won't work with the Conservatives. So I think there's a lot of factors at play here, and it's pretty difficult to say at this point what that will look like.
Now, it's worth pointing out, Francis, that in 2006, Stephen Harper won the most seats in the election, but did not have a majority, and didn't have a coalition or any kind of partnership going forward with any of the opposition parties, but did find a way to govern kind of issue by issue. So that's possible too, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about that. I think it's probably the most likely outcome if we end up with a Liberal minority. I think they may decide not to try for a coalition but rather to go issue by issue. And there certainly are a lot of difficult issues waiting to be addressed. You know, there's that pipeline, there's climate change, it's not going to go away, and our relationship with the United States is bound to be volatile, and at least until they have their election, and maybe after. So I don't envy them.
Yeah. There is the case, though, that gets made, Theo, that minority governments produce better results than majority governments. I'm not sure if that's always the case, because I think they can also sometimes be, there can be gridlock, there can be partisanship, and they can end pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly if you're, a left-leaning voter or an NDP voter, that certainly is something that we've seen historically. You know, I think a lot of NDP supporters would agree with you there. But we've also seen during the Harper years those two kind of very functioning minorities that he had, and I think that's the one story here is that, you know, Canada has a long track record of functioning minority governments. Fine, we've never been in a situation where you actually need three parties to back legislation. Usually it's just two parties. But this is not something we haven't seen before. We've seen minority governments. They tend to work. They tend to last around 2 years. And I don't think the electorate would be very happy if Parliament comes back to them in 6 months from now and says we want to have another election. I think whoever is responsible for triggering an election in a short period of time would pay the price.
Right. So, Paul, there's, for both Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau, I think there's a glass half empty and a glass half full kind of scenario. For Andrew Scheer, I think a lot of people a year ago would have thought if you can hold Justin Trudeau to a minority, that's a big accomplishment. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is that there are probably some Conservatives who think that he could have done a better job of capitalizing on this and won the election, which he might still do, or even won a majority, which seems less likely. For Justin Trudeau, a lot of people could look at it and say, well, you kind of blew the big lead you had a year ago. But then on the other hand, some people might say, given all that's happened with SNC, the blackface, brownface scandal, and other issues, broken promises, if you get to stay in government, that's a pretty big win for you. So how do you think the members of each party are going to look at that?
So it's always a question of what you decide the baseline is. Like, Shearer has done well or poorly compared with what, right? With the expectations when he was chosen leader, the expectations at the beginning of the campaign. I mean, the government seemed very vulnerable. SNC Lavalin dominated our politics for the first half of this year. You have to say that this campaign, unlike Trudeau's campaign in 2015, Scheer's seems like a beta run. Like, it seems like, your practice round, right? Trudeau in 2015 ran a campaign that seemed very much like a professional, established, experienced leader might do. Shearer's campaign has been faltering in all sorts of ways that seemed like somebody who still wasn't comfortable in the role. And so the Conservatives have to decide if he doesn't win, has he brought Trudeau down enough that it's worth keeping around for another shot next time? And it has to be said that if he goes and gets anywhere close to Trudeau, it's going to be hard, I think, for the Conservatives internally to find a dynamic to oust him. Trudeau, I think, if you look at the first 2 years, he had a honeymoon like no other prime minister in my memory. He squandered it in a number of significant ways, and I think that this campaign, he in a way, he came into the campaign looking better than he deserved to do, based on the earlier in the year at the SNC-Lavalin. And then there was the blackface thing, which I think actually, in retrospect, I think the journalists were a little too quick to judge that it hadn't affected his prospects, because people were anticipating maybe there'd be a 5, 6, 7 point drop in the polls in the first day or two, and then it would be sustained. I think it knocked the Liberals off their entire campaign. I think that they wanted to take the high road and portray Shearer as somebody who was out of tune with Canadian values. I think it mixed up the narrative they were trying to build. I think it destroyed any possibility of renewing the kind of idealism that appealed to young voters last time. But that having been said, if he comes, even if he comes second and Shearer forms a government, I think if Trudeau decides he wants to stick around, it'll be very hard to oust him.
Really? Even if he is not the prime minister?
I think we are not in the situation we were, say, in the Chrétien Martin years, where we had two defined camps with a central command and are ready to go. There are a number of Liberals who are well placed to replace Trudeau, I think, if there's a leadership campaign. But is there an internal kind of critical mass within the Liberal Party that would have the gumption to try to push him out? I don't see it yet.
What do you think, Maura? Because it's depending on how things go tonight, I could see a scenario where both Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau are leading their party in the next federal election, which could be sooner than later. And I could also see a scenario where neither of them is leading their party in the next federal election. That's possible too. Or one or the other, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could certainly see a scenario tonight where both parties decide that their leaders have underperformed relative to expectations. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how that'll play out. But I think, you can certainly see on the one hand, I think not so long ago, a lot of Liberals would have told you that they felt pretty confident about a second Liberal majority. And that really has fallen apart this year with SNC, with certainly with, the blackface controversy, which is more recent. But there have been a lot of errors, I think, and some unforced errors on Trudeau's part. And so, I think it'll be interesting to see how the Liberals decide he has performed after tonight. Andrew Scheer, on the other hand, I mean, I think that the Conservatives could decide, if he does not form the next government, that he has underperformed. At the same time, they could also decide that, if he reduces the Liberal majority to a Liberal minority, well, that's still something, I think what Paul said is right. It kind of depends what the baseline is. If the Conservatives say that, only a Conservative government is sufficient, well, then they might have a problem after tonight. But if they decide that, simply having done a certain amount of damage to the Liberals, that's good enough for now, well, he could carry on, I think. And I mean, similarly with Jagmeet Singh of the NDP, I think the expectations going into this campaign were very low. And there was a lot of feeling, I think, that he had underperformed as a leader. So if you take that as the baseline, Jagmeet Singh's now looking very good.
Yeah.
If the NDP manages to retain about the same number of seats that they have right now, which is sort of what the polls are suggesting at the moment, well, maybe they decide that's a win. So yeah, I think it really kind of does. And
the point about the baselines is that Jagmeet Singh has overperformed his baseline as of August, but not the expectations when he was selected leader a couple of years ago, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at what NDPers hoped back then, it was, it was not just like treading water and holding their own and not getting wiped out.
That's right.
But it is interesting because I think, as you've suggested, that Jagmeet Singh has gone from being perhaps the most likely to lose his job as a result of this election campaign, which is what most people would have said maybe 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, to being perhaps the most likely to hang on to his job, or at least second or second in that category. So campaigns matter to the leaders, and they don't matter to the rest of us. So we are standing by and expecting Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, to make an appearance in the Saskatchewan riding of Regina-Wascana, which is where the Conservative candidate is Michael Cram, running against the incumbent Ralph Goodale, the Liberal candidate. So we'll go there live as soon as that happens. That could be any minute now, but in the meantime, we are going to hear from you. We might have to jump in and go to that live event, but let's go to the phones and hear from John in Surrey, British Columbia. Hello, John. Hi, John.
Yes, my question for the panel was, did they believe that Barack Obama did the extraordinary act of endorsing Trudeau to kind of smooth over the blackface incident?
Okay, good question. What do you think, Theo? Do you think that Obama's intervention into this campaign negated that in any way?
I don't know if it negated that. I think I agree with Paul that there was, certainly an impact there, and largely by limiting any upside in the Trudeau campaign. I think it was just, I don't know whether they were the Trudeau team asked Obama to put out that tweet. Clearly, they're kindred spirits in a way. And I'm sure, Obama wanted to help out a prime minister who was struggling, and he is on the ropes, right? I think that this election will be a loss for the prime minister. Objectively speaking, he'll have fewer votes and he'll have fewer seats, and is potentially at risk of losing power. So I think the President Obama wanted to give an old friend a helping hand.
Yeah. Do you think it made any difference, Francis?
Well, yeah, I do. But I think the lingering effect of the blackface is not so much that people now think the Prime Minister is racist. I don't think anybody thinks that. But I think it's opened doubts in people's minds about whether he is who he appears to be. And there's some other suggestions of that in the last couple of years. The SNC is sort of the worst case. His relationship with Jody Wilson-Raybould and former Minister Philpott, all of that suggests that he isn't the guy he presented himself to be. And I think the blackface incident just reinforced that worry in people that, that he didn't seem like the person who would ever even think of doing that. Just, tasteless, if not racist. So probably Mr. Obama's endorsement helped a bit. I don't think it's going to shake that, that whole bowl of jelly. I think more things have to happen for people to get past that apprehension.
All right, let's go live now to Regina-Wascana in Saskatchewan and watch as Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, meets with supporters there, campaigning on behalf of the Conservative candidate Michael Cram. This is Ralph Goodale, the Liberal cabinet minister's riding. We'll go there live now.
It is so good to be home in Saskatchewan, everyone. Today is the day. Today is the day. We've been working hard for 40 days, but Mike has been working hard for even longer. And the people of Wascana are tired of a Liberal member of Parliament who always votes against them. Ralph Goodale has sold out Saskatchewan time and time again. He voted against major pipeline projects that would get Saskatchewan resources to other markets. He voted in favor of the carbon tax. He voted in favor of the tax hikes on small businesses. Today's the day we are all going to send Ralph Goodale a message. If he won't vote for Saskatchewan, we won't vote for him. So, we will win this seat if we get our vote out. We need all of you to hit the doors. Let's go get our positive message about making life more affordable for Canadians, about getting our energy sector back on its feet, about standing up for Saskatchewan. Let's get a strong voice for Regina-Wascana in Parliament. Let's get Mike Cram elected. go do it. Let's go do it. Good luck. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, making a quick appearance in the riding of Regina-Wascana, which is the seat held by Liberal Cabinet Minister Ralph Goodale, who's running for re-election there. Michael Cram, who lost to Goodale as the Conservative candidate in 2015, is running again there this year. So this is the kind of appearance that the party leaders are making on election day, going from riding to riding close to where they are running. All of the party leaders are back in their home ridings or nearby, and we'll all be in those areas on election night tonight. So we'll be seeing what they have to say coming up later this evening, and you'll watch it all live here on CPAC. Our coverage begins at 7 o'clock Eastern time tonight, and we'll have the results coming in from across the country until the final set of polls closes at 10 o'clock Eastern time, 7 o'clock Pacific time in British Columbia, and then we'll start to have a picture of the next government of Canada. So let's get back to your thoughts on this election campaign. Let's go to Don in Calgary. Hello, Don.
Yeah, Mark, always enjoy your show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm worried about jobs and fiscal responsibility, and I just wanted to ask your panelists one thing. The Greens and the New Democrats want to shut down the Canadian resource industry and paralyze the Canadian economy for their own moral platitudes. But there's no carbon tax on Saudi oil, and there's no downstream or upstream emissions on Saudi oil, but there's no criticism of Saudi oil. Why do you think that is from the Liberal Party? Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your call. Theo, a quick thought on that?
I mean, it's the existential issue in Canada right now. Do we or do we not want to be an oil-producing superpower? And I think no other issue divides Canada more. And, you know, we do see it regionally. We do see it, you know, rural-urban, the rural-urban divide. It really is a major issue. And, you know, if you look at you know, where the Liberal vote, where the Liberals are bleeding in terms of votes, they're bleeding largely, they're splintering to the left. They're splintering to parties that want the Liberal Party to be more aggressive on climate change. And if you look at the Conservatives, you know, they aren't their support. They're the champion of the oil sector. And so if you look at where the you know, where the pull is coming from, it's pulling towards Canadians wanting some type of or some more assertive policy on climate change. And I think that those fault lines in Canada are going to be there after the election. And I think Canada needs a leader to come up with some, you know, some fashion to reconcile that divide, because it is a dangerous divide.
I think if you it's been common for people to say that this election is not about anything, that it's the Seinfeld election, that there hasn't been any. I think people look back to the '88 election and say, oh, we had this big debate about free trade, and every discussion, every debate, every interview turned around this one big question. But I think for the proponents of doing aggressive action on climate change, this is a comparable issue, if not even a more important issue than free trade was. And if you look at the distribution of sentiment, some polls suggest that climate change was the number one issue, or close to the number one issue. But then you break it down by party, and you see it's Liberals, it's Greens, and it's New Democrats who in very high proportion think it's the most important issue. When you look at Conservative supporters, it's in single digits. It isn't even 10% think climate change is the most important issue. So that there is a deep cleavage, and the parties, the Conservatives on one side represent one point of view, all the other parties, including the Bloc, represent another point of view, and it's going to be very difficult for any party of any stripe to bridge that gap. And the Liberals, in the last election, and to some extent still, the idea that they have a pipeline, but they also have a carbon tax, we're trying to bridge that gap, but that middle ground is shrinking.
Yeah. All right. We're going to want to check in now with Globe and Mail reporter Michelle Zillio, who is on the ground in Montreal with the Trudeau campaign. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. So yesterday was interesting because all of the party leaders spent time in British Columbia yesterday. So what was it like for the Trudeau campaign, and why do you think there was so much of a focus on BC?
There was definitely a lot of focus on BC because this is a part of the country where the NDP is quite strong with the rise of the Mr. Singh's party. The Liberals focused on 3 out of 5 of the ridings that they were in were NDP-held ridings yesterday. They really do think they have a chance at winning in these areas, so they're trying to focus on that progressive vote, pitching themselves as the progressive government, not the progressive opposition, selling that message there. So, you know, we saw a very large crowd in Vancouver for a rally, and then we went to Victoria where there was a huge lineup out the door and people could not get in. So, you know, big turnout for Mr. Trudeau closer to the end of the campaign. We were starting to see crowds towards the 1,000, 2,000 person range near the end.
Okay, and towards the end of a campaign, you can often gauge how what the outcome is going to be based on the mood of the campaign. Have the Liberals been upbeat in the last few days? What's the mood been like?
I think the mood's been pretty good. They seem confident that they are going to win and get the most number of seats. I would say that there's definitely a sense of the fact that they're not, you know, they're down in the polls. The response hasn't been quite the same. You know, Mr. Trudeau has been the prime minister for the last 4 years, so he's been open to a lot more scrutiny, but they're working really hard. You know, we landed in Montreal this morning at 7 a.m. I took a red-eye flight the night before. We were flying all night, and they're just, you know, using the days to just jam in whistle stops and campaigning, and then flying overnight so they can use up every minute of usable time.
Do you think Justin Trudeau has been humbled by what's happened in this campaign and the fact that where a year ago most people would have assumed he'd be re-elected to a second majority government, and now it seems much less likely?
I think the blackface and brownface photos definitely, you know, took a hit on the campaign, and he felt that. You know, the apology that he repeatedly issued did seem sincere. You know, he expressed regret many times over, but they continued to, as you know, in their words, choose forward, move forward, and focus on their platform. You know, issues of climate change, of affordability, and he did continue to face some questions on the blackface and brownface incidents. But it appears that, you know, most Canadians have forgiven him for what he did and have moved on. And we'll see if they want to keep him in power later tonight when we get those results rolling in.
And what's Justin Trudeau doing tonight? Because, of course, a lot of eyes will be on him. If it is a minority parliament situation, his speech might be, depending on the circumstances, his speech tonight might be crucial in terms of the signal he sends about whether he intends to try to stay on as Prime Minister.
Right, and it looks like we are looking at a minority at this point, but again, polls and media have been wrong before, so maybe they will continue to keep that majority. But I will be looking for how strong a minority is if we end up there. Well, if he ends up in the 160 range, you know, the number of seats, that would be quite strong. They might be able to, you know, have a little bit more of a grip on power. But if they're lower in the 130, 120 range, then I'll be looking to that speech to see how Mr. Trudeau is framing himself for the next little while. And then, of course, when we get back to Ottawa tomorrow, the questions, if it is a minority, will start to swirl about who they're going to work with, whether the Liberals or the Conservatives, to get the confidence of the House.
All right. Many interesting times ahead. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Mark.
Michelle Zillio of the Globe and Mail. We will be checking in with other reporters over the course of the next hour or so as well. And we're interested in your opinions about the federal election campaign. What's driving your vote? What, in the end, was the factor that decided it for you? Let's go to Karen in Regina. Hello, Karen.
Hey, how are you, Mark?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Well, not too bad, dear. The reason I'm calling in is because I'm very, very, very sad. I won't say angry or mad or any of those words because I'm trying to keep us all Canadians, like, thinking with our hearts, you know, and of course our minds, our common sense. You know, to really, as far as all of this the environment, and like everybody wants to see a change in the climate and everything. Well, as Canadians, it's our responsibility, you know, for all of us to make a difference in the climate. Do you agree, Mark?
What do you mean by that?
Like, we should all be pitching in to make a difference.
Okay.
All of us. Like, not one government, whoever they decide to elect to get in, is going to be able to make a difference in the climate. It
Right.
takes
So
all
are,
of
are
us
you saying,
Canadians.
Karen, are you saying that that you wish it wasn't so much of an issue, or that it wasn't, that there wasn't a choice around that in this election, that all the parties kind of had consensus around that issue?
Yeah, and also, like I said, like myself, I recycle. I do everything that I can to make a difference, any way that I can.
Right.
And I think that all of us as Canadians need to teach the millenniums, like, you know, that we can all pitch in, we can all make a difference as Canadians. You know, it starts with us that makes the difference, right?
Okay.
Don't get me wrong with this pipeline going through and people talking about that. I mean, that means a lot of jobs for a lot of people. I know in the Maritimes, like, we really, like, the jobs are so badly needed there. It's unbelievable. Like, once the mill shut down, repap shut down, that took away so many jobs. When Sweden had purchased repap, it left pollution in our waters, mercury in our fish. And as natives, that's our livelihood, right?
Right. All right, Karen, thank you. Thank you very much for your call. I appreciate it. Let's go to Martin in Laval, Quebec. Hello, Martin.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
So I see a big coalition in this city, and between all the parties, is between the Liberals, Conservatives, most like Liberals, NDPs, Bloc, and the Greens. In terms of always, I see so far in terms of like a lot of groups inflicted in the main parties, and in some ways even sympathetic, even the media around too. It's like, I don't get it. Why in Canada? It's like, in particular in Quebec, with all the lefty groups around, radical groups who actually get in pipelines and everything, but most likely they don't care about anything what they supposed to believe. And in some ways, like, I don't get it. Why in Canada we should allow the main parties playing identity politics in terms of Bloc Québécois or the Liberal government? Look at the facts. They vote even against the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, in terms of asking questions, and even they just planting. Then in terms of say what we can do or not do, in terms of NDPs, they most likely play identity politics. We have to be implicit with everybody, but they don't even understand in terms what is the unique about Canada, or what is about even the Liberal government with the Bloc Québécois. They tend to always play a card to say, we want to protect the French, we want to protect the French. What about the Anglos in Quebec, you know?
Okay.
They don't even get it. It's like, I don't get why it's always implicit about Quebec when all the country got conflicts. I support the pipelines, but nobody talks about it. But a lot of times it's like a lot of groups between the unions and some media outlets.
I'm going to jump in just because we have a lot of people to get to. Thank you very much for your call. Let's go to Marie in London, Ontario. Hello, Marie.
Hi, how are you today?
Fine, thank you.
That's good. I just wanted to say that I'm finding that this election is, to me, the most critical one that I can remember in Canada. The decisions that the electorate make today, or it could go, well, they'll make it today, but it could go into the night and the morning, but the decisions they make are going to change this country forever, especially if they're voting for Justin Trudeau. He's shown us that he is not who he says he is. He has come against in some cases, if you don't agree with him, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. I really believe that if he is allowed in 4 more years, he will destroy Canada as we know it. If he gets a majority, especially, he will destroy Canada as we know it. There'll be mass immigration. You see, and the other thing that's really bothering me is this climate change hoax. It is a huge coup d'etat, and it's being put there. It's a major lie that's scaring all our young people and even elderly people, middle-aged people. And what it is, it's a way to get society to come together so that they can take over, basically. And our sovereignty is gone.
So,
and it's
sorry,
the
who's taking over in that scenario?
Well, it's the elites and the secret societies. And it is not a conspiracy. It is actual truth.
Okay. Marie, thank you very much for your call. Next up is Tim in Surrey, British Columbia. Hello, Tim.
Oh, hey, Mark.
Hi, go ahead.
It's been a very interesting election, and I think a lot of it may also have to do with the timing of what's happening down south. I wonder whether minority, if it is a minority, which it could be likely, it'll be interesting to see if it's the Liberals, because if, say, for example, those 3 other parties, the Bloc, the Greens, and the NDP, have any sway, it'll be interesting whether they'll bring up what I would call uppity issues. And what I mean by that is issues that will deal with, for example, stuff that I've seen on your own channel here on CPAC, like a national transportation strategy, whether that would be naive enough or scary to both either a conservative or liberal minority government. In Ralph Goodale's thing, they were talking about the lack of public transit in I believe, Regina, Wisconsin, of all places, right, because of the provincial. I think provincial issues are also going to bleed into it. Or, for example, the issue of is it a guaranteed income? Or issues such as that, which do not get a lot of play, I think, nationally, because it doesn't maybe affect a lot of the people. And so that's going to be interesting about the minority. Whether or not there's also the foreign policy part here, which is Trump. That may be Trudeau's ace in the hole. Maybe, maybe not. After his press conference today, a lot of people might be going, well, it might be better to have a type of minority that may not fracture very quickly, because it sounds like we could even be doing this next year while the American election is on. And that could also have, I think, reverberations here. The thing about, I'm just going to say very quickly about Obama talking to Trudeau, I don't think that's really all that a surprise, even if there was the blackface issue. The reason being is because of the timing of the North American elections. I think that Democrats are interested to see what's going to happen here. And I think people like Bernie Sanders have had a lot to do with that, and Trump, because they are different in how they've been able to use policy, and that's influenced a lot of places. Brexit could even have a big influence here as well, too, when it comes to, for example, the issue of why the Bloc may have been so popular, maybe not, because of the issue of Scotland and their referendum, and the fact that once they said no to independence, they voted a whackload of Scottish National Party people into the House of Commons. So I think you have a lot of things happening here that could possibly have a result of a minority. Now, you might have a majority. If that is the case, then all maybe bets are off the table. But I think if you have a minority, you're going to have certain issues that people might laugh and sneer at because they're of lower income, but they may be brought forward by groups like the Green Party. As I said, if you talked about this 10 years ago, Mark, people would have laughed. Now I think because of what's happened worldwide, issues that people thought were stupid and funny are no longer that case. Thanks, Guy.
All right, thank you. Kenny in Chilliwack, British Columbia. Hello, Kenny.
Hello, I think Trudeau is going to win 75% of the 25% of the people that vote. He's going to win hands down. If he doesn't win, this country is screwed, because he's going to stick up for First Nations people to take control of our cutting rights and our drilling rights back. Because we never had a discussion about that. Like, we need to settle land claims proper so First Nations people don't have, like in BC, you got the NDP party in BC. They're the ones that got clawback on First Nations people, 300 and some bucks a month. I've been paying for 15 years in another 2 months. You know what I'm saying?
All right, Kenny, thank you. Thank you for your call. Luke in Toronto. Hello, Luke.
There.
Hi. Go ahead.
Get off speaker here. Yeah, I just want to talk about kind of watching the debate. It was kind of like watching a bunch of children, and I just wanted to put it out there to the leaders that, you know, not focusing on character assassinations is something that makes you seem like a human being, and I think there's a lot of people that basically were turned off voting, period, because it just seems like a bunch of children, you know. So that was the one point. And the other point is in conversations with me and my father, we talk a lot about how we should be working with the natives, our First Nations, because they do speak for the earth, and they should be guaranteed a seat, especially at our debates. It was kind of embarrassing to have them kind of offered to hold the mic, and I think we should be focusing much more on that in whomever gets into power.
All right, thank you. Terry from Oakburn, Manitoba. Hello, Terry.
My issue is that in this area, which is a rural area here, of course, a Tory stronghold in Dauphin Swan River, there was really no campaign at all. We really didn't meet the candidates from any of the parties. There was no party literature, hardly any campaign at all, no debate on the issues. The big issues, of course, this is an agriculture area, and there was really no debate on that. Our communities are dying completely. We were looking at rural development and what can be done to kind of keep some of these small towns and villages alive and vibrant. And we see nothing from the other political parties. Like obviously it's a Tory stronghold, but you would think that the Greens, the Liberals, and the NDP would do more organization and try to make themselves more visible in the constituency to try and drum up some support. They've just seemed to give up, and we don't hear anything or see anything of the candidates as we go to vote today, and that's it.
Okay, Terry, thank you for your call. Actually, that's an interesting point, Maura, because I think if, I'm just going by memory here, but really the parties all of them spent the vast majority of their time in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia during this campaign, right?
Yeah, I think a certain amount of time out east, I think, as well, because
Yeah.
there's predicted to be a certain amount of change there. But yeah, I mean, it's the curse of being in a safe seat, you know, you just, and I think, you know, often you can have actually candidates who are working very hard in seats that are, you know, Liberal or Conservative strongholds or NDP strongholds, what have you. You can have candidates who really are trying their hardest to campaign, but one of the things that happens often is they don't get the support from the national organization because and the parties have a limited amount of funds. They are expending those funds where they really need to fight for seats, where there are seats that they risk losing, where there are others that they think they can pick up. And so, you know, the Liberals aren't going to probably spend a whole lot of time or money on a riding that has been a Conservative stronghold for however many years. So, you know, it can mean that even the best meaning candidate who is doing the best work locally on the ground that they can do just doesn't have the resources often. So it is unfortunate, I think, for people living in those ridings who want to see more substantive debates and a more substantive campaign, but that is unfortunately the reality of things on the ground.
And the leaders are going to spend a disproportionate amount of time in the places where there are the most votes, right? And where they can, in some cases, move from riding to riding very quickly, right? Because the ridings are geographically small.
That's right. And, yeah, for that reason, of course, you're always going to see the leaders spending a lot of time in the GTA, a lot of time in Quebec, which is always a battleground. And, of course, we saw most of the leaders, I think the 4 main leaders out in BC over the weekend, as that's predicted to be an important place during this election campaign. But there's whole swaths of the country. I mean, you look up north at the territories, right? It's 3 ridings across a huge part of the country, and they almost never get any attention at all. It's a tiny population, only 3 ridings. It's not fair, but that does tend to be how things happen.
Francis, I wanted to ask you about the extent to which Indigenous issues have been a part of this campaign. What are your thoughts on that? There are a couple of callers have raised that, and of course, the current government's relationship with the Indigenous community is. There have been questions raised about that over everything from pipelines to the expulsion of Jody Wilson-Raybould.
I don't share the common view that the Liberals messed up in this area. I think they achieved a lot in 4 years. They didn't achieve the most important thing, which was, arguably the most important thing, acceptance of the rights and recognition framework that they had been prepared. They wanted to build consensus around that. Didn't happen. But the boil water advisory communities are dropping. The massive progress made with Inuit. Inuit are very happy with this government. They made great progress in terms of building new institutions, changing the fiscal relationship. And there's been a parallel process to improve financing in First Nations. They're not that one isn't finished. It's hard to say what will happen after the election, but they tried a lot. I'm really surprised at how little coverage there's been of Indigenous issues, that aside. The NDP certainly have, Jagmeet Singh has done a very good job. He had a shining moment when he talked about why shouldn't people in First Nation community have clean water if everyone else can. The money's
and why do we talk about how much it's going to cost when we wouldn't do that if it was Vancouver?
Exactly. Yeah.
For example.
And that was, that was a great moment for that issue and for getting Indigenous issues on the table. Mr. Shearer is ignoring Indigenous issues. I understand there's quite a bit of discontent in his own riding from the 12 First Nations who live there. He doesn't have much support in the Indigenous community, and he hasn't said much throughout the whole campaign. So it's very unfortunate because we had some momentum as a country after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission especially. It was starting to fuse into the society. People were interested and cared. And I think we need leaders that will keep going in that direction.
Just an interesting point on this with regard to the formats of the debates. I think there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the English debate in particular, but there was a section on Indigenous issues. The problem was that a lot of the leaders just took those questions and redirected them to whatever they wanted to talk about. In the pipelines, in the CBC face-to-face, they weren't exactly debates, but where they presented a leader with individual voters, where the leaders sat across from somebody who was an Indigenous person and had to answer questions. It was much harder to go sailing off onto whatever else they wanted to talk about. And the only point I make there is that a variety of different kinds of encounters, of debates, of discussions is actually what benefits us most, not just having one big night where we get to see them all together and maybe the format works, or as in this case it didn't work, but actually putting them in different positions can actually bring out more that voters might take aware of. Yeah.
All right, let's go to Pat in Winnipeg. Hello, Pat. Pat, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Hi.
There was a thing about the campaign that really, really bugged me, and it was the fact that none of the leaders spent any amount of time in Manitoba. In fact, they didn't even talk about Manitoba. They practically skipped right over us, plus Saskatchewan and Alberta. Did the prairies not count anymore? Anyway, and there's another issue. Nobody brought up the harsh conditions from our Indigenous people. One of the things that they really, really need help with is the supply of food And the price of food up there is absolutely astronomical. And I do know that because it was a few years back, I did live in Nunavut. And food was just awful. Terrible, terrible. But anyway,
okay. I appreciate those comments, Pat. Thank you. Brian in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Hello, Brian.
Hi, good morning. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
Hey, listen, I'd like to, ask your opinion, but also your panels about the media's role in the negativity of this campaign. I talk to a lot of people every day, and so many people are just put off by the negativity. But when you look back at the campaign, from the moment the writ was dropped, the media, asking Shearer about his same-sex this and Trudeau about his that, and then they harp all day long on the negatives. And the positive seems to get very little of the media coverage. I mean, not you guys so much, honestly. I speak more of the mainstream, but the reality is it just seems that all they want to do is harp on the negatives. And when you talk to people around Canada, that's all they seem to, be upset about. So anyway, I don't know your opinion on it.
Sure. Brian, thank you for your call. Paul, this is something you've looked at a little bit.
I think if you look at the very first week of the campaign, before all these things that we're talking about, what the single most striking thing was that everywhere Andrew Scheer went, the Liberals dropped a depth charge on whichever candidate he was with that day, with some negative thing that suggested that they were an extreme social conservative or that they consorted with the alt-right and so on. So the sunny ways, and it's very interesting, the Liberals have, if you go back to the last campaign and the Liberal emphasis on positive campaigning, I think that you can actually see to some degree that they have tried to persist in this. Like last weekend, you might say, well, why aren't they like hammering away on Premier Ford instead of showing pictures of Trudeau at rallies? But at another level, like not in the formal speech, not in the advertising, but they started off the campaign in a very negative light. And then we had a series of media-generated stories, the blackface, and then Shearer's problems with citizenship and with his resume and so on. And part of the reason that these stories got such a grip was that we were not debating a big issue. I think if we had had a campaign where, we weren't just debating about, cell phone rates or, well, everybody wants to do something about housing, but they want to do something different about housing. If we had a bigger set of issues, I think maybe we would have had less of this, but absolutely the media, in the absence of other discussion points and fed by the parties themselves, the parties have been very aggressively feeding negative information into the system, even to the point of untruthfulness in some occasions. So there's been a kind of nexus between the media and the parties have played a role, or the media rather, have played a role in that.
Yeah. Maura, I know you have to go in a moment. Any final thoughts on what you'll be watching tonight and how this might all play out in the hours and days ahead?
Well, I personally am heading off to Montreal. I'm going to be with the Bloc Québécois tonight, so my focus will be primarily on Quebec, which will play a pretty big role, I think, in determining what the composition of the next government looks like. But yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I'm expecting a pretty late night tonight. I think it's going to be interesting to see not only whether this is minority majority, but particularly if it is a minority, what that composition looks like. How strong is the minority, either of the Liberals or the Conservatives? How many more seats do they win than the other parties? And how influential are these smaller parties like the NDP and the Bloc Québécois going to be, and the Greens for that matter?
Just a quick thought before you go about the rise of the Bloc Québécois and what that potentially could mean in terms of national unity, in terms of the role of the Bloc in this new parliament.
Well, Well, I think the national unity question is really interesting, right? And not only because of the Bloc Québécois, but I think you are seeing, we talked about how, the prairies in Alberta have maybe been overlooked a little bit. I think there is this sense, certainly out west, of neglect by this government. I think that will persist. And then if you add to that the rise of the Bloc Québécois, who are also playing on this idea of Quebec being neglected, being attacked by the other provinces for its positions on, pipelines and that sort of thing, and on Bill 21, of course. I think when you add those together, you are definitely looking at potentially a parliament where there's a lot of regional division across the country, and a lot of parties that are really representing very specific regions and very specific populations of this country, like the Bloc in Quebec, the Conservatives out west, the NDP in BC and Ontario, and so forth. I think that potentially is going to make for a very interesting next parliament if we are in a minority scenario.
Yeah. All right, Maura, thank you. Safe travels. We'll be watching to see what you have to say after witnessing all those events tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maura Forrest of the National Post. Our remaining panelists will stay with us for the remainder of our program. And coming up, we're going to continue our look ahead at election night. And we want to hear from you what you predict the outcome of the election will be. We're interested in your thoughts on that. So give us a call, 1-877-296-2722. Send us a comment online using the hashtag CPAC Vote 2019. Let's take a look now at how this campaign unfolded.
When Justin Trudeau launched the election campaign, he appeared to enjoy the easiest path to victory.
Hello, Vancouver!
The tested campaigner taking on 3 newbies in their first contests as party leaders. The Trudeau mission, play up the accomplishments and the need to win again to carry on the program of progressive change, urging the voters to
choose forward!
But it turned out the slogan was a tough sell. Unlike 4 years ago, Trudeau has a record in government, and many voters, angered at broken promises on electoral reform, balanced budgets, climate action, Indigenous rights, and clashes with female ministers, aren't so sure choosing forward actually means moving forward, or at least not as fast as they'd like. Trudeau acknowledged as much during the campaign, but insisted he's the only one who could carry on the progressive agenda Canadians want and need.
I know that we need to continue to move forward on investments in families, not cuts. Investment in infrastructure, not cuts. Investment in a real plan to fight climate change, not a commitment by Andrew Shearer to rip it up the day after he got elected.
People know that this election is a choice between Justin Trudeau and myself, between a scandal-plagued government that has broken promises, led by a Prime Minister who has lied to Canadians directly.
The 2 frontrunners in the campaign, the Liberals and Conservatives, locked in a dead heat in the polls, made promises to appeal to their existing voters, not new ones. And in the absence of truly big ideas, the Liberal and Conservative campaigns were knocked off the rails by their own leaders and their current or past transgressions. Justin Trudeau and blackface, the SNC-Lavalin controversy, and more. Self-inflicted wounds that damaged the Prime Minister's brand. But the Conservative leader had some unforced errors of his own.
I haven't been asked a question, so...
You've been honest about it. You've never told anybody.
Well, I've never been asked about it. I've never hit it.
That's concealing my omission. Look, things would have been
I would disagree.
That answer about why he never divulged his dual citizenship with the United States left the Conservative leader looking secretive. Andrew Scheer entered the campaign as a relative unknown to most Canadians. When voters did learn more, the polls suggested they liked him less. Voters also heard allegations that he exaggerated his CV as an insurance broker. And then there was the repeated refusal to provide his personal views on abortion until he finally did.
Millions of Canadians have a different position on this issue. And like millions of Canadians, I am personally pro-life.
What could have been a unifying challenge, climate change, instead became more divisive, even for the parties that want more ambitious action. Even after hundreds of thousands of Canadians took to the streets demanding urgent action, the parties, all the parties, attacked each other's plans and commitments instead of talking about ways to find common ground. No idea was above partisan dismissal or complete distortion.
You promised to balance the budget this year.
Maybe because the polls were so close, the campaign was so ugly, with personal attacks.
Mr. Trudeau, you are a phony and you are a fraud and you do not deserve to govern this country.
And accusations of misinformation.
There is a divisiveness in this election that I think Canadians are noticing and reflecting on. And the choice is, do we give in to the misinformation and fear, like unfortunately so many of our neighbors and allies around the world have given into in their political discourses? Or do we stay true to who we are?
To listen to the campaign attacks is to believe that not a single leader had a single redeeming quality. Then again, how to explain the rise in personal popularity of the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, the only racialized leader ever of a mainstream Canadian political party? His performance in the debates drew new attention from voters. His performance off the stage drew admiration. There was his emotional, measured response to the controversy over the Justin Trudeau blackface images.
But I got a message from a friend who reminded me that there's a lot of people out there that couldn't do that. They couldn't fight back. They didn't have the ability to do that.
And this polite rebuke of an elderly man in Montreal who told him he should cut off his turban to look more Canadian.
Oh, I think Canadians look like all sorts of people. That's the beauty of Canada. I don't agree, sir.
In Rome, you do as the Romans.
Hey, but this is Canada. You can do like whatever you like.
Suddenly, a leader who faced signs of an impending mutiny before the campaign began leading supporters in dance at jammed campaign events and was being mobbed by young people on the sidewalk. Singh's rising personal popularity and the unexpected surge in support in Quebec for a reborn Bloc Québécois changed the campaign. We may not know how much until the votes are counted, but as voting day neared, the polls suggested a minority government for either the Liberals or the Conservatives was now the most likely outcome. So Justin Trudeau made an 11th hour appeal to the same voters who had flocked to him in 2015.
If you want a progressive action, you need a progressive government, not a progressive opposition. Voting Liberal is the only way.
And Jagmeet Singh's musings about a possible coalition with the Liberals in a minority parliament provided ammunition for the Conservatives in the dying days of the campaign.
I believe Canadians now have a crystal clear choice between a Trudeau NDP coalition that will raise taxes, run endless deficits and make life more expensive, and a Conservative government, majority government, that will live within its means, lower taxes, put more money back in your pockets.
In the end, the campaign served to highlight the growing divisions of Canadian society: East versus West, Conservatives versus Progressives, rural and urban. Rather than exploring ways to bridge differences, the campaign seemed eager to exploit them. By the end of a campaign described by so many as a campaign about nothing, the choices for voters seemed clear. Vote for the leader or party you dislike the least. That works if you want an election that merely produces a winner, whether voters are inspired or not.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, guys.
Once again, it is time to have your say on CPAC. Thank you for joining us on this Election Day edition of the program. By the way, we will be here tomorrow and every day for the rest of the week talking about the aftermath of the 43rd general election. I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Thank you again for being with us. We are going to get to as many of your calls in the next 45 minutes or so as we can. So if you're on the line, we appreciate your patience. We will get to you as soon as possible. And this hour, among other things, we want to know your thoughts on tonight's election. Our question to you is this: what do you predict will be the outcome of the election? Call us at 1-877-296-2722 or tweet us at CPAC_TV. You can also email us at haveyoursay@cpac.ca. Much of our panel remains with us, including Paul Adams from Carleton University, Francis Abel, also from Carleton, Theo Argydas from Bloomberg News, and joining us now, Philippe Lagacé from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University.
Nice work.
Trifecta of Carleton professors here. So, Philippe, let's talk about what happens next after tonight. Obviously, if one of the parties wins more than 170 seats, the path forward is very clear. That's a majority government. That's what we've had in the last two elections. Pretty straightforward. But if that's not the case, as appears increasingly likely, what happens?
Well, it really depends on what the composition of the House of Commons is. If you have a very tight result, in all likelihood, it'll be much more dramatic. And I say that because certain possibilities then open up. So for instance, one of the debates that we had over the course of the campaign, at least in these last few weeks, was who actually gets to govern in a situation where there's a party that has the most seats but not a majority. Now, formally speaking, the Prime Minister remains Prime Minister until he resigns or is dismissed by the Governor General, but the Governor General is in no position to dismiss a Prime Minister who hasn't lost confidence and is reassuring her that he intends to meet Parliament as soon as possible. So what that opens up is the possibility of Prime Minister Trudeau, even if his Liberals have not won the most seats, staying in power and attempting to negotiate an agreement with one of the other smaller parties in order to stay in government. That said, the custom in the country, particularly when the margin starts to widen, so if we're talking 10 to 15 seats more for, let's say, the Conservatives, the custom will start to weigh pretty heavily on a Prime Minister on election night if that starts to be the result. And in all likelihood, if that's the case, the Prime Minister will probably concede defeat, at which point the Conservatives have to figure out how they are going to govern in a minority parliament, knowing, as we saw during the last weeks of this campaign, that certain opposition parties have been fairly vocal in their unwillingness to work with a Conservative government. Now, does that mean that they're actually going to still adopt that position once Parliament resumes? That's more difficult to say.
Yeah. Now, what you've raised, though, is an important point, that effectively the Prime Minister can't lose his job in an election. He can only lose his job by resigning or in Parliament. Now, of course, a consequence of an election can be that he'll lose his job in Parliament if he attempts to bring a throne speech forward and the majority of the House doesn't support that throne speech. But a Prime Minister doesn't actually technically lose his job in the election.
Right. I think it's important to recognize that the office of Prime Minister is one bestowed on the Crown through the Crown's prerogative, and it's separate and distinct from the position that the Prime Minister holds within Parliament. So you can even have situations, as we did with William Lyon Mackenzie King, where the Prime Minister actually loses their seat in Parliament, but they remain Prime Minister. So it's important to also note that these are all formalities, right? So they only really come into play in very awkward constitutional situations. Most of the time, this is fairly dull and boring. So if another party comes in with a majority, it's pretty clear that the Prime Minister is well aware of the fact that they won't be able to stay in power and they're simply going to concede defeat on an election night, which sends a clear signal to the Governor General in that case that she would commission another party to form government. And
that can happen with minority outcomes as well, as it did, for example, in 2006 when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, and Stephen Harper won 21 more, and the Conservatives won 21 more seats than Paul Martin and the Liberals. And that night, election night, Paul Martin said, I'm stepping down as Prime Minister, and Stephen Harper became the next Prime Minister.
Exactly. I think it's fair to say, again, that is a fairly important custom that we have. It's not binding constitutionally, and it can be set aside in particular circumstances. But as that seat margin begins to widen between the incumbent and a new party that has the most seats, the pressure on that Prime Minister to simply concede defeat for reasons of fair play, democratic propriety, or whatever else you want to factor into it starts to weigh fairly heavily. But as we saw just last year in New Brunswick, you can have a First Minister who decides to make a go of it, give it a shot, even if they haven't won the most seats. So it can get interesting.
Yeah. Now, what about minority parliaments and how they work? There's been a lot of talk of coalitions in the last week of the campaign, but that's not the only option, obviously.
No, coalition tends to mean something very specific. So coalition means that you have a government with ministers from more than one party. That isn't something that we typically see in Canada, generally speaking, and very rarely at the federal level. The last one that we had at the federal level was during the First World War for a very specific circumstance in terms of ensuring national unity and conscription. We've seen it in some occasions at the provincial level, such as in Saskatchewan, but generally speaking, what we have instead is either a minority parliament where the government attempts to work on an ad hoc basis with parties on an issue-by-issue basis because it gives them quite a bit of leverage. They know they can maybe get a budget passed with one party, get a piece of legislation passed with another. Or you'll have, in some cases, as we have currently in British Columbia, where the governing party will conclude a confidence and supply agreement with one of the other parties in order to ensure that they support one another on major confidence measures, so it brings a certain degree of stability to Parliament.
So if either the Liberals or the Conservatives have the most seats in a minority parliament situation tonight, it's not necessary for them to enter into some formal agreement. They could just try to bring forward a throne speech and hope that other parties support it, or negotiate with them to put things in it that they will support.
Right, and I think it's important to recognize that confidence and supply agreements tend to be more important when the margin or the possibility of falling increases. So there again, if it's a very tight result and you could fall on any given vote, the importance of ensuring that you have guaranteed support on certain issues increases quite substantially. So when you look at a case like British Columbia, where I believe we're talking about maybe one vote difference between the government staying in power or potentially falling, then it's fairly important to be able to lay down very clearly who's going to support you and on what. But as we saw during the Harper years, if you've got a good margin of seats and the other parties either have lost a leader on election night or they're in a weaker position and they may not want to be in an election, the government or the governing party may decide, you know what, we don't want to bind ourselves or tie ourselves down. We can make a go of this leveraging the other parties. So we start entering into quite a bit of electoral strategizing here, thinking ahead to the next election already.
Right. And the next election could be sooner rather than later, if it's a minority parliament, right?
Right. So minorities tend to last 2 to 3 years, depending on which party is in power and what the situation is of the smaller parties. So again, if a good indicator of how much stability we're probably going to have over the next few months is whether one of the party leaders resigns tonight, particularly from one of the major parties.
Meaning, if somebody resigns, we're likely to wait a little bit longer for an election?
Well, it provides a little bit more stability in the coming months because a party that doesn't have a full-time leader is in a weaker position to run another election campaign, even if they have the money to do so. So if you're, let's say, Justin Trudeau and Andrew Shearer resigns as leader tonight, your chances of being able to manage Parliament over the next few months increase substantially because the Conservatives are on a bit of a back foot.
Right. All right, we are going to get back to your opinions in just a moment. Let's check in now with Toronto Star reporter Alex Ballingall, who is on the ground in Burnaby, British Columbia, following Jagmeet Singh's campaign. Alex, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And there were a lot of stops in British Columbia yesterday. What was the reaction to Jagmeet Singh like?
They're feeling pretty good about him right now. We've been in BC, sort of hunkered down here since I guess it was Friday morning after he had sort of a send-off big rally in Brampton, which is where he sort of started his political career. But out here in BC, they've toured Vancouver Island, where they're in some tight races potentially with the Green Party. And then since then, we've been in the Lower Mainland in Burnaby, where Singh has his own seat, Surrey, and Vancouver, and the polls are showing a lot of tight races here. We saw all the here on Sunday with Andrew Shearer and Trudeau and Elizabeth May campaigning in the Lower Mainland. So it'll be interesting to see. It might come down to BC tonight if the polls are right and it's really close. We'll see. I'm in my hotel room right now writing out all the background for the various scenarios. It seems like there could be many different ways this could play out, so it should be interesting to watch.
Yeah, you're going to be busy if that's what you're doing right now. We won't keep you too long, Alex. So what about Jagmeet Singh? And this campaign is certainly ending much differently from how people expected it would, or certainly much differently from how it began with Jagmeet Singh, when there was even speculation that he might not make it to this election campaign as NDP leader.
Yeah, it's in some ways I see it as like the inverse of what happened in the 2015 campaign, when the NDP came in with, as the official opposition, the high hopes of potentially forming, government for the first time. This time it's like the flip of that, where the expectations were they couldn't have been lower almost. Talk of official party status. I was Googling like what was the NDP's worst result ever, just for reference. It seemed like the hopes were really low, and for probably a bunch of reasons through the campaign. The party seems to think it's the force of Singh's personality, that he's been gregarious and positive in a campaign that's sort of been marred by personal attacks and sort of squabbling between the two major parties. His favorability numbers went up, and then they had sort of that bump in the polls that got them a safe distance ahead of the Greens. And just being with the campaign for the past few days, they're all smiles. They're feeling really good about how they're doing and hopeful about tonight. Yeah,
the interesting thing is, of course, the NDP could actually end up with fewer seats in this election than the last election, but it could still be perceived as a win for Jagmeet Singh because it's not as much of a disaster as was feared, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it's a weird sort of way to frame victory, but that's exactly how they feel. That they sort of pulled back from the brink of disaster, and now 20, 30, 40 seats, potentially the balance of power, especially if they hold that alone. If they alone could put, say, the Liberals, I guess, over the threshold of majority, then they're laughing. Basically, they will be very happy with that.
Yeah.
I think.
So what's happening tonight in Burnaby?
So right now, we just Singh went over to his campaign office and sort of fire up the volunteers for their Get Out the Vote push today. And now he was going to do like a walk through a park, and today that we're basically at a hotel in his riding in Burnaby South, and they're setting up in a ballroom downstairs, and where he's going to give his speech and hail in the results. I'm told that at around I guess 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific, he's going to be in a room with his wife, taking in the results and potentially calling candidates out east in the Maritimes and Newfoundland, where they hope to pick up 1 or 2 seats they think maybe they could get in St. John's and in Halifax, but we will see.
Okay, Alex, I appreciate you checking in with us. Enjoy election night. Thanks for being with us.
No, thanks for having me.
Alex Ballingal from the Toronto Star in Burnaby, British Columbia, where Jagmeet Singh is running for re-election after having been elected in a by-election in BC. So let's get back to your phone calls on the 2019 federal election. And we'll go to Cheryl in Saskatoon. Hello, Cheryl.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have a feeling that more people are going to be voting Liberal than what's being polled out there. It's almost, when you say that you say out loud that you might be voting Liberal, people ask, how can you do that with the SNC and the blackface? And, so in order, I think that people are going to vote Liberal. It's just kind of like on the down low when they don't feel comfortable saying that publicly or to the pollsters. That's how I feel.
Okay, thank you for your call. Pete in Creston, British Columbia. Hello, Pete.
Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
I want to quote something from a book called A Call to Account. No matter how we citizens feel or think about the government, it's the most important institution in our lives, affecting what we earn, what we buy, and how we're educated, virtually everything that we do. So how do we make a government accountable to us? How do we monitor, for instance, what it does with what we pay in the form of taxes? The government collects $200 billion. Now, this is my opinion right here. And I've been fighting with the federal government over my Canada pension. And it's locked in at $368.5 billion. Now, I'm entitled to this. I paid into it. And I'm anxious to get some money back. And I pay 43% in the form of taxes. And yet when I send information to whatever political party, I don't get any answers.
Okay.
And that bothers me quite a bit.
So how does that impact for
election.
you in terms of the election and how you view this election?
Well, I'm getting to that.
Okay.
I'm annoyed that campaign people go around, Jagmeet Singh or whatever, I can't pronounce his name, Mr. Shearer, Mr. Trudeau, Miss Elizabeth May, and that guy from the Bloc. Now, they promise us the world, but when I can't get any information or my voice isn't heard for the amount of taxes that I pay. Now, I have a member of parliament in British Columbia that, in my opinion, doesn't do very much for me. And yet I would like to vote for maybe the NDP leader, but I have to put his name on the ballot. I think that when we vote federally, we should have a say as to who we want as a prime minister, and then vote for the member of parliament that's supposed to support us.
Right. That's not how our system works, though, as you know.
No, and that's annoying because, again, I have to vote for
right. For a local representative.
In my opinion, that's right.
Yeah. All right, Pete, thank you. Michelle in Edmonton. Hello, Michelle. Hi, Michelle.
Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just, obviously my prediction for the outcome of the election is that we are going to have a minority government moving forward. Whether it's Liberal or Conservative at this point is anybody's guess. What's really been bothering me, though, is the lack of talk about the situation in Alberta regarding the pipelines and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that we have lost here and how that affects the economy of the rest of Canada. The big sentiment in Alberta right now, and I don't know if I'm sure you're aware of it, is the talk about separation. That is a real problem moving forward. I've been seeing polls that say 80% of Albertans at this point are in favor of separating from Canada. I would just like to find out from your panel, what are their views on that, and is that truly a possibility moving forward, especially if we have another Liberal government?
Okay, thank you very much for your call. Theo, what do you think? Is Alberta separatism a real thing? Is it likely to become enough of a movement that it could be an issue going forward?
I don't know if Alberta will move towards separatism. It is being talked about widely, but there's no historical precedent for that sort of thing. I mean, Quebec, where we do have a history of sovereigntist movements, these have been part of the political culture there for a very long time. In Alberta, it's largely one issue kind of matter, and the issue is energy, and I think that so it's not kind of deeply rooted in the culture of Alberta, for example. It's largely around a sense of feeling neglected on a pretty important issue, which is their economic well-being. There is the potential there if we are in a situation where the Canadian government, especially in a kind of a Liberal minority government that's relying on either the NDP or the Greens, moves more aggressively against the oil sector, those tensions will escalate. Whether there's going to be an outcome where you have a strong pro-pipeline or pro-oil government that can actually get something done seems very unlikely as well. I don't know if it's going to lead to separation or to what extent this will go, but certainly there is the potential there for things to get worse in Alberta, clearly.
Yeah. Francis?
Well, in fact, things will get worse in Alberta because the oil economy cannot survive the next generation. There's going to be massive changes internationally. We'll still be producing oil and we'll still be using it, but ultimately there will be less of a need for Alberta resources, and Alberta will need another way to provide a well-being for its people. Maybe we should be looking at the Notley government's attempt to try to square that circle with a combination of measures that were helping the industry keep going at the same time as diversifying the economy. And it seems to be if we have a national government that doesn't address that issue for Alberta and Saskatchewan, we're headed for trouble because those parts of the country really do need some kind of sensible strategy for, say, the next 20 or 50 years. Not the next mandate, but the next 20 years, say.
Yeah. All right, we are going to check in now with Canadian press reporter Catherine Lévesque, who is on the ground in Regina with the Shearer campaign. In fact, moving across the ground, if I'm not mistaken. Catherine, you're actually on the bus right now?
Absolutely. Hi, Mark.
Hi, thank you for joining us. Yeah. So we did see, all of the campaigns have been going to as many different places as they could over the last few days, particularly in British Columbia. We saw all the party leaders there yesterday. Tell me a little bit about what the last 24 hours has been like on the campaign for Andrew Scheer.
Well, it's been very interesting. Like you said, Andrew Scheer has been going to the three main provinces where there will be interesting battlegrounds. So that means Quebec, Ontario, and BC, they got their hopes up. I think the mood is quite good right now. We don't know whether it's going to be a Liberal or a Conservative government tonight, but definitely they are optimistic. And we saw Mr. Shearer this week even said that the government will be formed by the party that has the most seats. So maybe they have some internal polling right there that, are keeping their hopes up right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, publicly every campaign is extremely confident in the final days, but sometimes you can kind of read between the lines, or you can gauge their behavior, or even base some assumptions on where they're traveling in the final few days of the campaign. Are there any sort of clues like that in terms of just how optimistic, how upbeat the Conservatives are?
Well, definitely here in Saskatchewan, it's been interesting because we just came back from door knocking with the Conservative Michael Cram. So he's running against Goodale. He's the only Liberal MP and also Liberal cabinet minister. He's been here for 26 years. So definitely today, what Andrew Scheer was trying to do, there are two ways of looking at it. Either it's a smart move because he's occupying the media time today on election day and showing he's got momentum. Either they've got a weak field ground and, they're trying just to get as many votes as possible in this riding and make sure Saskatchewan turns blue completely. So, they are optimistic. They're trying very hard, but at the same time, we've seen that Mr. Scheer did have a few difficult days in the past few days with the Warren Kinsella claims that he was trying to work against Maxime Bernier's party, but they're not talking about that right now.
Yeah. So what's the plan for the rest of the day with Andrew Scheer's campaign leading up to the results being released tonight?
So like I said, we just finished door knocking, and then Mr. Scheer will be voting later today at the end of the afternoon, and then afterwards there will be a rally, and we'll be listening to the election results from there. Okay, sounds great. Catherine, thank you for checking in with us. Catherine Levesque from the Canadian Press joining us from Regina in Saskatchewan on the Conservative campaign bus. Let's get back to your opinions, and we'll take a call from Blair in Lakefield, Ontario. Hello, Blair.
Hello, how are we today?
Good, thank you.
Yes. One thing that's been really bothering me is, I don't really ever hear anything, idea of trying to get our deficit paid off. I would think we'd be running our country like a business. Like, the business should be always trying to make money and trying to keep out of debt. Is if we came up with more ways as all of the voters and the people and the actual politicians would stop spending the money on things that aren't really needing to be, and we held back for 1 or 2 terms, and we kind of knocked our deficit off, would that not make sense? It would allow us a lot more money to actually spend on things that would actually help us out in the long run without going into more debt. I don't know how much money we are paying in interest per day, but I would imagine it would be so much money that would just astronomically blow everybody's mind in the country up. It doesn't make any sense. Everybody is wanting this and wanting that and wanting this. Well, the only way we're going to get that is if we pay for it. Okay, well, not everybody agrees with what we're going to pay for, obviously, but I think we should be coming together and finding out the most important things. And really, I think the most important thing is to get out of debt. As you take a look at some of these countries that are out of debt, look how much they're prospering, and look at their resources and what they can dictate to other people, because we are ahead of the game, not behind.
Okay. Thank you very much for your call.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for your call. Richard in Kapuskasing, Ontario. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Thanks to your panel again for taking opinion of people. And like I say, I think right now we're going towards a minority government. I mean, it could be liberal or conservative. After watching all the debate, I've watched right from the first debate to the last debate, I don't think even the 2 runners were either one of the best, which is, I think that Trudeau or Shearer didn't show anything that would impress anybody, and that's why we are in a minority government. I think if Mr. Shearer would add a bit more charisma, he might have stand a better chance. But either those two, we never had a chance to look at Maxime Bernier's platform. The only way we had a chance to see the platform of Bernier was on the French channel when the Patrice Roy had the control over who was going to be the speaker and when was the debate. It's pretty sad when you have also a conservative destroying Bernier's platform. You would think probably that I'm going to be a Bernier fan, but not really. After watching all the debate, you ask most of the people who they would vote for, they're still undecided to this day. That's pretty sad.
Okay, thank you very much for your call. Clinton in Surrey, British Columbia. Hello, Clinton.
So Trudeau, he said he would run a deficit to fix our infrastructure right off the bat. So I don't know what everybody's complaining about. He said that he was going to do that, and I'm glad he did. He has given so much to our transportation. He stood up to that tyrant Trump. Who went down to Washington, D.C. to sell us out? Harper went down there, and the Conservatives went down there to sell us out.
What do you mean by that? In what way did they sell us out?
The Conservatives took my wife's CPP away. Trudeau put it back. Shearer is a traitor to this country. He is, just like Trump, a liar, a fraud, and a racketeer. Trudeau hasn't had the time to do what he said. Give him the time. Give him that time to do it. The economy is excellent, and he has created many jobs. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, thank you for your call. We'll go to Art in Milton, Ontario. Hello, Art.
Hi, Mark. How you doing?
Fine, thank you.
I would like the panel's opinion regarding SNC-Lavalin, depending on what party wins the election, what will happen if the Liberals win, or what will happen regarding SNC-Lavalin if the Conservatives win.
Okay, good question. Thank you for that. Paul, first of all, how much of a factor do you think that was in this election campaign?
Well, I think it set the background and the baseline, and it was certainly sort of operating in the background in the sense of affecting the perceptions of Trudeau. I think were reset to some degree by that scandal over the first half of the year. If you remember the first day of the election, the Globe and Mail dropped a story on SNC-Lavalin. The Globe even almost seemed to be wanting to frame the election a little bit around SNC-Lavalin. It had been a great story for them for the first part of the year, but it didn't seem to resonate in kind of the day-to-day sense. If you get into a minority situation, you know, we haven't heard the end of this story. You know, SNC-Lavalin is still out there. There's still the question of, you know, we just don't know how it's going to unfold. And I think that if you get into a minority situation with whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives, honestly, we probably have not heard the end of this story. And if the Liberals are in power, sustained by say the NDP and maybe the Greens, it's also going to be a delicate point of contention. So I don't think the story is over yet by a long shot.
Yeah, Philip?
Well, this is one point that's worth making about minority parliaments, is that not only is it a question of the governing party not having a majority of seats in the House of Commons, they also don't have a majority of seats on parliamentary committees.
Right.
So to Paul's point, as we saw in the spring, efforts by the opposition to keep this, the Justice Committee going on SNC-Lavalin were effectively shut down by the Liberal majority on the committees. If we end up with a minority parliament where the opposition parties control those committees, that opens up far new avenues of investigation, particularly if the Conservatives are able to convince the NDP to reopen this issue. It's also worth pointing out that during the Harper years, we saw quite a bit of this, of Parliament using, through its committees, significant parliamentary powers, notably the power to command documents. You might recall the Afghan detainee scandal, where the parliamentary committee first recommended to the House that it obtain documents related to Afghan detainees. That was deemed a matter of national security by the government, but ultimately Speaker Milliken ruled that if Parliament demands those documents, they get access to those documents. So we may even end up in a situation where there's a constitutional debate to be had about whether or not Parliament should have access to cabinet confidences related to SNC, which, as we'll all recall, have been a big question, even with respect to whether the RCMP has had access to everybody they want. So I suspect in a minority parliament, unless the Liberals are able to have some kind of agreement with the NDP that this is an issue that doesn't get reopened, that this may come back in a big way.
Yeah, and it seems unlikely that the NDP would agree to that, to say, yeah, we're going to back off on that, right?
Well, this is it. I mean, would they really want to be in a situation through a confidence and supply agreement that limited what they can do in Parliament? Strikes me as unlikely.
Yeah. And it could be argued, depending on the math again, that the Liberals will need the NDP more than the NDP need the Liberals, right?
That's right. So, and certainly under a Conservative-led government, I suspect that even the NDP would still want to work potentially with Conservative members in order to reopen this. So unless there's a Liberal majority, we may see SNC coming back.
Interesting. All right, I want to bring on CPAC social media analyst Winston C., who has been with us throughout the campaign, to share with us how the election has been playing out on Twitter, on Facebook, and elsewhere. Hi, Winston.
Good afternoon, Mark.
So it is finally Election Day. Tell us a little bit about how the parties have mobilized their work and their campaigns on social media.
Well, we're finally starting to see the amount of money that these different parties have used on social media in different ways, especially leading up to yesterday, October the 20th. This is a look at some of the numbers when it comes to the Facebook ad spend. This is courtesy of the Facebook ads library, where you can see the Liberals have spent upwards of almost $500,000 in different Facebook ads, whereas the Conservatives have spent significantly more. This is on their main account at $840,000, and the NDP at much less, $180,000. What's interesting to note is that Justin Trudeau actually had an increased amount of spend in addition to that $490,000, a total amounting to about $347,000. So when you add those two numbers up, it actually puts the Liberal Party on top of the Conservatives there. But all of this proving that Facebook ads is definitely playing a much larger role when it comes to promoting the different leaders' platforms and campaigns and getting that out there, all in this day and age where we're talking about this social media election. Is that really it? We're seeing that with the Facebook ad spend.
Yeah, very interesting. What have Canadians been searching for as they head to the polls today? I think this has been one of the most interesting visuals that you've shared with us over the course of the campaign, is portraying what it is that that the voters are searching online. So what's on people's minds today?
Well, lots on people's minds. I think people are definitely looking for a refresher of what the leaders' platforms are. There are many people who still now at 3:46 Eastern Time don't know what the different leaders' platforms are. So this is a look at some of the different leaders' searches, and it actually shows trending searches on all of the leaders' fronts. So definitely picking up as we are nearing the voting stations closing. There's definitely still time left there. But one of the interesting dives is with Justin Trudeau, where you can actually see that Justin Trudeau's Obama endorsement remains one of the top searched items when it comes to Google. You see Barack Obama, Justin Trudeau taking over the first 4 of 5 trending searches there, which is definitely very interesting. And then the graphic that you were mentioning, Mark, was actually the issues, and the issues remain all over the place. We see healthcare at the trending list. We see taxes as well on that list. So definitely all over the place. But when it comes to the actual queries themselves, definitely very basic in nature, voting hours, polling stations. But then you see things like federal election platform guide. That's up 130%. So just another reminder that people do still need to know. And that's why so many people are watching CPAC today.
Yeah, So people are actually searching who should I vote for in the federal election. So maybe Google will help them out, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether Google is the best source to help you determine who you should vote for. You should definitely take all information with a grain of salt and be an informed voter, check in it with multiple sources, all those good reminders there. But of course, Google is very much a tool that people do use when it comes to trying to figure out who to vote for.
Yeah. I wonder if Google Home and Amazon Echo have...
Alexa, who should I vote
exactly. for? Exactly. I wonder if they've built in any responses to that. I'll have to try that out later. So Elections Canada actually, when it comes to social media, they warned people about taking selfies at polling stations, which, I mean, given how much of an inclination people have to take selfies to portray any experience they're having, it's only natural they would think about taking a picture of themselves at the polling station or even while they're voting. So the warning went out. There are fines and theoretically even a jail term that could go with photographing a ballot. You're not supposed to do that. So what have you seen on social media?
Well, a very good reminder there. When it comes to social media, I think the biggest thing is people are using social media to remind people to get out there, to try to encourage that voter turnout. Instagram, Facebook, all out with tools to, once you do vote and capture the photo that you're allowed to take outside the polling station, post it online and remind your friends and family to get out and vote. But when it comes to what has actually been happening, Manitoba, of course, we've seen there have been quite active storms and polling stations have been affected by that, and people have been posting. This is a post from Manitoba Hydro on Twitter saying, our line workers voting today at Southport near Portage la Prairie before they continue storm restoration efforts. So all of those hydro workers getting out to the polling station. So if they can make time to do it, you can as well. Kevin Meisner posting this. This is out of Toronto Danforth, where there was a bit of a power outage this morning that didn't close down any polling stations, but people were voting in the dark. Power has since been restored there, but definitely something that affected many people in the Greater Toronto area. This is a post from Shannon saying election day fail, went to vote 30 minutes after polls opened and was told I could not vote because the official responsible for poll number 141 hadn't arrived. And another one from Aaron, bit of a long lineup at my polling station, but it was gone by the time I finished. Took 20 minutes total. So it only takes 20 minutes. Many people are saying less than that. And one more here from Simon saying, through all their faults, I love what social media platforms are doing to encourage voting. And that's to mention all of those tweets and rather those tools that many of these networks have implemented.
Yeah, and I think that is important. If people are seeing other people voting, it probably does encourage more participation. We'll see how that bears out in the numbers. One thing about paper ballots, though, is they still work even in a power outage. So
that's true.
Even if it's dark. So we have been asking our viewers for their predictions tonight. Have you seen predictions on Twitter?
Well, we have been, and it's kind of all over the place, as is with the polls, and the only poll, of course, that matters is the one that happens tonight, and we'll have extensive coverage of that. Joey saying, actually having quite a detailed prediction there, saying, I have zero beliefs in polls, never have, never will, other than today's election poll. My prediction, Conservatives with 150 seats, Liberals with 121, NDP at 35, and it goes on there. He says it's going to be an interesting evening. Austin saying prediction, Orange comes up huge and takes seats from the Reds. Blues get more chairs than Reds, but not majority. People's Blue will surprise a lot of people tonight. French Blue will become relevant, and Green did their best. So kind of rounding out many of the sentiments there. And Minta Ford saying election predictions, because who doesn't like being proven wrong, since I inevitably will be hashtag CDN election 2019. So definitely lots of people who are going to be predicting, and we'll definitely find out what happens later on tonight.
All right, and you'll be part of the coverage tonight. Winston, thank you very much for being with us once again.
Thanks so much, Mark.
CPAC social media analyst Winston C., who again will be part of our coverage tonight, which will continue after Have Your Say, and then results starting at 7 o'clock Eastern Time when the polls close in Newfoundland and Labrador. Paul Adams, let's talk a little bit about polling, because you've looked at that space, you've worked in that space. Pollsters have been very much maligned in the last few years. I think we should offer a disclaimer on their behalf that when the results are very close, as they have been in most of the polls recently, that any factor could contribute to some movement, some adjustment. That could all be within the margin of error, and it could still look very different from what some pollsters have been forecasting. But what are some of the factors that could change in the final hours of the campaign?
So the two things that are most frequently responsible for polls getting it wrong are turnout. That's hard to predict. That turnout in the last election was higher than expected. It was higher than expected among young voters, who are a group of people who often don't turn out in large numbers. That probably accounted for some of the reason the polls got it a little bit off. The other reason is the people making up their minds at the last minute, and we were seeing in some of the polls, even a few days ago, there was a considerable chunk of people who were saying, "Oh, I've made up my mind, but I could still change it," or these kinds of things. So these are the kinds of things that are a little bit unpredictable. We know that polls, by and large, predict the winner right about 4 times in 5, but the pollsters are protected in this election, I think, because unless there's a majority for one of the parties, I don't think anybody's going to say,
they got it wrong.
They got it wrong. Where they're more vulnerable is where they appear to be clearly all agreed that so and so is going to win.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to tell you what my prediction is. I think that there's too much uncertainty here, and I have my
you
hunches.
portrayed a range before of scenarios. Philip, anything else about our system of parliament that comes into play in these circumstances that people should be mindful of?
Well, the point I would stress simply, if the result is very close, is to pay close attention to what the leaders say tonight.
Right.
I think a lot of the coverage will probably declare a winner based on their seat projections, and that may or may not be accurate depending on what the Prime Minister comes out and says. So I know this is tilting at windmills here and nobody will listen, but nonetheless, I really do sincerely hope that even if it seems like it's a very close Conservative quote-unquote victory, that some of the networks pull back a little bit and wait to see what the Prime Minister has to say.
Well, we've already seen the language change a little bit around that even the seat projection sites are not saying Conservative minority anymore. They're saying Conservatives win the most seats in a minority parliament, which doesn't necessarily, again, mean they form government, right?
Right, and I think that's the key point, is at the very least, when the projections are coming in, let's hopefully stick to the saying, are we going to have a majority or minority parliament? Already that would be a good one. And if it ends up being quite tight, let's wait to see before declaring anything what the Prime Minister has to say. And similarly, even with Andrew Scheer, let's wait to see what he has to say, and from there we'll be able to have a better sense of what's going to happen in the coming weeks.
CTV was running an ad saying the most exciting part of election night is announcing the Prime Minister.
Well, this is it, right? It's that kind of language which makes my blood boil, but there we are.
All right. Thank you all for being part of our discussion today. Great to have all of your insights, and enjoy the final few hours of this election campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we want to say thank you at home for watching and for joining us. Stay with CPAC as we continue to take your calls. So stay on the line if you've got a comment, because we may be able to get to you in the next few minutes. We will talk as well about some of the key races and regions in Canada. Your thoughts on the election campaign. CPAC's election night results we begin covering the results at 7 p.m. when polls close in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then please join us again tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, for the first post-election edition of Have Your Say. We're going to leave you with some thoughts from voters about what it would take for them to be more engaged in federal politics.
I am pretty engaged, so I don't know how I'd say I'd get more. More local stuff. You know what? They need to advertise stuff better when they're having debates or when they're having get-togethers and stuff like that. Say the Liberals are saying, we're meeting here or meeting. We never know in this town.
Engaging me more in federal politics would be having some things that are closer to home, and having our political people, our leaders especially, coming around to our small places and being able to engage with us.
If governments want to engage us, they connect us with jobs.
It's disturbing that a lot of people are not informed, especially the younger people. They don't watch the news, or they watch it on social media. They're very poorly informed and they don't bother to vote.
I'm fully engaged.
I support. I've been a supporter for what I believe is the future for my children and my children's children's children, and I'm fully engaged. I am a voter. I have voted every single federal election, and I will continue to do so until I die.
Like, I always appreciate when the candidates come by and actually talk to you personally. I know that's a lot of work. Also offering like information forums, that would be engaging, and actually presenting things that are really meaningful to me. And if it stands out, like I said, important issues to me like climate change, that's definitely going to be something that engages me.
I guess one of the things that turns me off of federal politics is when politicians, instead of actually stating what it is they're for, they point out things that they're against in other candidates. So if there's more constructive debate, that's more appealing for me.
Well, meeting with the candidate coming at my door, that really helps me, make a link with them and connect with them. So I think that is more engaging for me, having a conversation with people running or people helping with people running.
When you talk politics, everyone's got their forum, everyone thinks they have the demographic that they need to choose, how they need to come, but they're not really touching on the issues, and I hate political deviation when it comes to conversation, so that would get me more engaged.
To engage anybody, I think we need to see more clarity. Optics is important in terms of our confidence in our leadership, so I think they need to, I guess, emphasize to their constituents that they're being honest about things.
So that's kind of hard to come by, You don't know who to believe or what to believe. Everybody's got a story, and once they get in, generally speaking, they can't do what they said they were going to do.
A battleground riding is one where two or more political parties have an equal chance of winning. And it's where elections are decided, helping parties to claim a region, province, or win new ground. Battleground ridings are especially important in close elections, where they can make the difference